At what price? Freedom. For many years I had worked toward this day, and finally the young boy's visit was scheduled. Walking back and forth, I watched out my front window waiting for 9-year-old Jimmy to arrive from the orphanage. From what I gathered, it was Jimmy's first visit to a real family home. Almost his entire childhood had been spent in an orphanage or some form of institution. I knew that he would be scared out of his wits, as Judy and I were almost total strangers to him. "He's here!" I yelled at Judy as I watched the station wagon pull into our driveway. Judy and I walked out onto the front porch to meet Jimmy. "A little scared, are we, Jimmy?" Judy said as she smiled at him. "A little bit, I guess." "Me too," she answered as she patted him on the shoulder. After entering our house, we placed Jimmy's small backpack in the spare bedroom. Judy and I walked back into the living room to give him a few minutes alone to get his thoughts together. When he walked out of the bedroom, I handed Jimmy and Madison, our 4-year-old granddaughter, a cold Coca-Cola, and the two of them walked into the dining room and sat down at the table. Jimmy would sit at the table for a minute or two, take a few sips of his drink, and then he would walk over and place it in the refrigerator. Then he would walk back to his seat, wait a few minutes, and then return to the fridge to retrieve his drink. 6 more times he performed this action. Little Madison walked over to me sitting in the recliner. "Papa, why does Jimmy keep opening and closing the refrigerator?" she whispered. "Just leave him alone, honey," I told her as I winked. "But you always get on to us when we do that." Looking out the top of my glasses, I gave Madison the look, letting her know to stop bothering and questioning me. "Jimmy, grab your hat, young man, and let's take a ride," I told him as I shook my truck keys at him. Within 5 minutes, we were entering the local Home Depot store. Just as I turned off the ignition, the boy turned sideways in his seat and blurted out, "I'll do some work around your house, Mr. Roger, for letting me visit with you and having food and stuff." "I know you would, Jimmy, but there's nothing that needs to be done. I'm all caught up with everything. Come on, let's go inside." As we entered the store, I headed directly to the appliance department. Stopping out in front of the refrigerators, I stood there with my thumb and index finger under my chin. "What do you think, Jimmy?" "What do I think about what?" "Which of these refrigerators do you think I should buy?" "But Mr. Roger, you got a nice refrigerator at your house now." "I know, but I like to plan ahead. Never know when one is going to need a new one, you know." "Son, you walk down this line of refrigerators, and I want you to look at each and every one of these units. I have to go get a box of sheet metal screws, but when I get back, I want you to let me know which one you think's the best." "I can just open all of them and I won't get into trouble?" "Open all you want and look at every one of them. Look them over real good, especially the freezer part." I turned to begin walking down the aisle toward the hardware department. As I rounded the corner, I stopped and looked back around the shelving. I watched as Jimmy slowly traveled from fridge to fridge, opening each and every door, inspecting it from top to bottom. On certain refrigerators, he would stand there opening and closing the door 10 or 15 times before moving on to the next unit. Little did Jimmy know that I too had been raised in an orphanage in Jacksonville, Florida, a very abusive orphanage, that I understood exactly what was going through his mind at this very moment. It was something that the average person would never think about, or probably could not or would not understand. I must have been 18 or 19 years old before I actually opened my first refrigerator door without getting into trouble. No child of the orphanage was ever allowed to get near or touch the refrigerator, much less open either of the magic doors. Oh, how much I dreamed of opening such a door when my little stomach growled many a night from hunger. How much I thought about the golden treasures that must lay waiting inside. I purchased my box of screws and several wire nuts, and then I returned to the appliance department. As I rounded the corner, there stood Jimmy waving his arms at me. "This one right here! This one's the best one!" he yelled at me. Within seconds, I stood before a 4-door stainless steel refrigerator costing some $3,800. Yeah, "That's a nice one, all right," I said as I swallowed when looking at the price tag. "Boy, my arm sure is getting sore," he told me. "Well, if I ever need a new fridge, that's the one I'm going to get, Jimmy." "You sure are a good picker-outer, Jimmy." "You think so?" "I know so." On the way home, I stopped at Walmart to pick up a new fan as the one in my garage was beginning to smell like wires were burning or something. I handed Jimmy $5 and told him to pick out whatever he wanted to drink and maybe a candy bar or two. After getting the fan, I waited outside the store for Jimmy to appear. It was almost 30 minutes before he walked out the door drinking a Dr. Pepper and holding tightly onto a plastic sack. "What you got there, boy?" "Well, it's kind of like real private kind of stuff." I said nothing more about the sack, but I sure was wondering what was in the big bag, which was causing him to clutch it so tightly to his chest. Driving home, neither one of us said a word. Right before we pulled into the driveway, Jimmy looked at me and said, "Mr. Rogers, since you gave me the money, I have to tell you what I bought." "You don't have to tell me anything, Jimmy," I told him. Slowly, he opened the first plastic bag and pulled out another plastic bag. Then he opened the second plastic bag and he pulled out a third plastic sack. "What did you buy, a whole bunch of plastic bags and sacks?" I said, laughing. "No, sir, Mr. Roger." Opening the third sack, he reached in and pulled out a 4-pack of toilet paper and he held it toward me. "Why would you buy that?" "I'm so sorry, Mr. Roger," he said, with a strange look on his face. "I'm sorry I used so much toilet paper when I went to the bathroom while I was at the Wally store. I just couldn't help it. I really couldn't help it," he continued. "Jimmy, I don't care how much—" I stopped my statement in mid-sentence. I, too, had been severely punished and several times beaten with an inch of my life by the orphanage matrons for having used too much toilet paper. I was almost beaten to death on one occasion for not having asked permission to use the bathroom. "Jimmy, Jimmy, Jimmy," I whispered as I reached over and rustled his hair. After putting my screws away, Jimmy and I walked out into the backyard and continued to talk. "Is there anything special you'd like to do?" I asked him. "Can I walk down this big ditch all by myself?" "Sure, go ahead." Jimmy walked about 10 paces, stopped, and stood there looking at the ground. "What's wrong, Jimmy?" "Can I pick up this here rock?" "Well, I don't see why not." He knelt down on one knee, picked up the rock, about the size of a silver dollar, and he held that position as he examined it. "Can I throw this here rock in the ditch water?" "Throw all the rocks you want, Jimmy." He stood upright, walked to the edge of the large ditch, and threw the rock with all his might into the water, causing a loud splash. I stood watching as 9-year-old Jimmy, a young boy, slowly walked down the ditch's edge, picking up various sized rocks, and began tossing them into the 3-foot deep dirty water. My eyes never left him as I watched an innocent human being finally beginning to understand and to feel what it was like to be able to be a young boy with a mind of his own. A boy who only wanted to think and feel. After Jimmy returned from his 30-minute walk, Judy and I asked him what he'd like for supper. "Can I have anything I want?" "You name it. Shrimp, steak, pork chops, whatever you want, that's what we'll have." "Can I have some SpaghettiOs for supper and maybe a Dr. Pepper?" "SpaghettiOs?" I shouted out in surprise. "I seen 'em on TV, but I ain't never had any," he replied. Later that evening, sitting in the middle of the table was a 3-quart pot covered with a towel. On each side of the pot were several large saucers with mounds of garlic bread piled high. At each table setting there was a large glass of ice and 3 Dr. Peppers at each setting. As we sat down, Judy removed the towel, exposing a large kettle of SpaghettiOs. Then she looked over at our 4-year-old granddaughter Madison and said, "Maddie, will you say the blessing for us this evening?" "Can I say it this time?" asked Jimmy. "Surely," said my wife. Jimmy, placing his hands below his chin, closed his eyes, and he said only 2 words. "Thank you." We remained quiet. As we began to eat our meal, Jimmy sat erect in his chair, speaking not a word. "Jimmy, we are allowed to talk at the table," I said jokingly. "We're not allowed to talk or smile or anything when we're eating at the orphanage." "Well, in this house, we're allowed to talk, laugh, and we're even allowed to joke while at the dinner table, as long as we eat." He looked down at his lap and he just sat there motionless. I got up from my chair and I walked over to the stereo. I pulled out a CD from our collection and placed it into the CD changer. I pushed the play button and returned to my seat. Within 20 seconds came a loud thundering from the two large stereo speakers. "There was a farmer had a dog and Bingo was his name, oh, B-I-N-G-O, 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 and Bingo was his name, oh." Slowly, Jimmy raised his head, and there was a great big smile on his face. As the music played, Madison began to clap, as did Judy and I. Soon, Jimmy was clapping and laughing. He yelled and screamed, and tears were running down both his cheeks. When the song ended, a total silence fell over the entire room. I asked everyone to close their eyes for 30 seconds without opening them. When they opened their eyes, Jimmy was gone. The sexually abused little boy who had always lived inside of me was finally free and was able to continue on with his life as an adult. I had finally given him the freedom that he had so desperately needed for almost 60 years.